another week of class. I hope you all are well and ready to finish out the semester strong. I am feeling a bit under the weather today, to be quite honest with you, which it just dawned on me. That's kind of yet another benefit of taking classes online, even when the instructor is ill, because we don't have to have face-to-face contact. I can still instruct. So that's something that had never occurred to me before. When I teach face-to-face classes, I am very mindful of staying away if I'm feeling ill, or making sure that my students stay away from me if they're feeling ill. So yet another advantage of online education. We don't have to expose each other to our germs. Okay, so enough with that rambling. We are going to start exploring the topic of gender inequality this week, something we'll look at this week and then also continue that discussion into next week. I'm just going to dive right in and start off with a few definitions. So first, it's important that we distinguish between the terms sex and gender. So sex is the term we use to refer to biological identities, so the distinction between male and female. We're referring here to first and secondary sex characteristics, genitalia, facial hair, things of this nature, chromosomal composition. So sex is very much about biology. In contrast to that, sociologists talk about gender as being more of a social construction, which is what the first reading you all have for this week is going to be addressing. We define gender as socially constructed expectations regarding the proper behavior, attitudes, and activities of males and females. So it's essentially what we, as a society, consider to be appropriate for men and appropriate for women. What is appropriate for masculinity and what is appropriate for femininity. And in American society, we often think of femininity or of women as being more passive, more emotional, more nurturing, and men are kind of thought of as the opposite of that, as being more aggressive, as being rational. Which is an important component of how our gendered system plays out in American culture. It's not only that we have two different genders, it's that those genders are constructed as oppositional to one another, or as dichotomous. Now, that's not to imply that there may not, that's not to imply that there's nothing biological to our gender traits, but from a sociological perspective, we focus more on how the social world influences how we think and how we do masculine and, or how we do masculinity and how we do femininity. And there are a couple of things that we can think about in terms of supporting this argument that gender is largely socially constructed. One, whenever you look at the traits associated with masculinity and the traits associated with femininity across cultures, we tend to see some pretty wide variations, and I think that probably resonates with most of you. And not only do we see cross-cultural variation in how gender is done, we can see gender being done differently within our own culture across time. So the traits associated with femininity today are vastly different than the traits associated with femininity 100 years ago. And again, this is something that I think seems intuitively right to most of you, likely. We are socialized into our gendered expectations. This is something to make note of. So when do we receive this socialization, or where do we get this socialization from? Well, we like to think, or sociologists like to think, that the gender socialization process actually begins while we're in the womb. What is the number one question asked of expecting mothers? We all know what that is. What is the sex of the baby, or what is the gender of the baby? And, you know, that question kind of speaks to the importance of gender, not only to our identities, but to our interactions and to the institutions we're surrounded by. One last point in terms of defining gender, it's something that is strictly policed in our society. So Whenever women deviate from femininity, they tend to receive some type of sanction or some type of response as a result of that. But especially when men deviate from masculinity or when they enact more feminine roles, they receive some type of sanction for doing that. And there's a reason for that, something I'll turn to now, actually. So the second reading for this week is on patriarchy. This is one of my all-time favorite readings. I think Johnson does a great job at very clearly articulating his model of what a patriarchal society is. He defines patriarchy as a society that is male-dominated, male-identified, and male-centered, and that involves the oppression of women. So keep those three aspects of patriarchy in mind as you're reading the material. The male-dominated aspect of patriarchy has to do with positions of authority generally being reserved for men. And this is very true in our own country. Heads of state, corporate CEOs, religious leaders, school principals, members of legislatures at all levels of government, they all tend to be male. And Johnson gives you some pretty good statistics in thinking about that. I'm going to post a website, an article from the New York Times that really kind of illustrates how male-dominated certain positions of authority are. Secondly, a patriarchal society is one that is male-identified. This is the idea that core cultural ideas about what is good and desirable tend to be more closely related to masculinity as compared to femininity. So when you think about those traits I mentioned earlier, power and aggression, rationality, those are traits that, one, we associate with masculinity, and two, traits that we tend to value more highly in society in general. And so in valuing the traits that are classified as masculinity, there's kind of this implicit devaluation of traits associated with femininity, especially considering, again, how dichotomous those two things are often constructed. Lastly, a patriarchal society is one that is male-centered. So this has to do with the majority of attention in society being devoted to men. And it's important to note here that that is really... that these three elements of patriarchy, it being male-dominated, male-identified, and male-centered, they all support and reinforce one another, because one of the reasons why our society is male-centered is because it's male-dominated. If you were to open up a newspaper on any day or from any day across our country's history, most of those news stories are going to be about men and what men are doing. And that's because men are the newsmakers. They're the ones in the positions of authority. I'm going to post a clip that kind of illustrates how pervasive this male-centered aspect is in our society. I think you will, and it's kind of satirical in nature. I think you'll enjoy it and maybe be a little bit surprised at what it's suggesting here. So that's all that I have to talk about this week in the video lecture. I wanted to make sure that we start to think about the difference between sex and gender from a sociological perspective, and then also how we can think about the systematic oppression of women, how we can go about analyzing gender inequality as it relates to the structure of society. So that's all for this week. I will post another video lecture next week. Hopefully I'll be feeling better. Have a great week. Bye.